October 19th, 1818, near a council ground called Old Town, on the ridge the Chickasaw called Pontotoc, in what would become the state of Mississippi. General Andrew Jackson and Governor Isaac Shelby, commissioners for the United States, sit across a table from Chickasaw leaders who have spent weeks negotiating terms. Among them is Tishomingo, already an old man by the reckoning of the time, and William Colbert, whose family has brokered land and diplomacy with the United States for 2 generations. The paper they are about to sign will be recorded as the Treaty of Old Town, though most histories remember it simply as the Chickasaw Cession. In exchange for roughly $300,000 paid over a period of years, the Chickasaw Nation surrenders its last claim to a stretch of ground between the Tennessee River and the Mississippi River, land that rises above the river's eastern bank in 4 steep bluffs the United States government has already begun marking on its own surveys as the Chickasaw Bluffs. The name stays. The people the name belongs to do not. The Colbert family alone, whose members sign alongside Tishomingo that October, will go on to negotiate at least 3 more treaties with the United States over the following 2 decades, each one trading away another portion of what remains of the Chickasaw homeland in what is now Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama, until the 1832 Treaty of Pontotoc Creek removes the last of it, and the nation is relocated west of the Mississippi entirely. What those bluffs are made of is stranger than the treaty that changed hands over them. The soil is loess, wind-blown silt laid down in sheets during the last glacial period, so fine-grained and so tightly packed that it can stand in a vertical wall 50 feet high without a single brace or retaining course, a trick almost no other unconsolidated soil on the continent can manage. Water moving through Loess does not erode it the way water erodes ordinary clay or sand. It finds the smallest weakness, a root channel, a crack from a dry summer, and it begins to dissolve a tunnel from the inside, a process soil scientists call piping. Left alone for decades, a Loess bluff will hollow itself into narrow, twisting passages and small rooms with vertical walls and flat, almost finished-looking floors, entirely without a human hand touching them. 19th-century travelers who found these formations along the Mississippi bluffs described them as though someone had built them and then left. Nobody had. The ground had simply done what Loess does when nobody stops it. The same property that makes Loess unusual to a geologist makes it valuable to anyone who needs to dig fast and dig deep without shoring the walls, which is precisely why, within a single lifetime of the 1818 Cession, the United States Army would come to rely on that same soil for a purpose the Chickasaw negotiators at Old Town could not have anticipated, and one that had nothing to do with the crops, hunting grounds, or river access. The treaty's language was actually written to address. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. Memphis rises on the 4th of the 4 Chickasaw Bluffs, founded in 1819 by John Overton, Andrew Jackson, and James Winchester, on land that had belonged to the Chickasaw Nation less than a year earlier. A small United States Army post named Fort Pickering already stood on the bluff by the 1840s, little more than a garrison building and a supply shed overlooking the river. Its purpose changes completely on June 6, 1862, the day a Union fleet destroys the Confederate River Defense Flotilla in full view of the city, and Memphis falls without a land battle. Union engineers move onto the bluff within weeks and begin expanding Fort Pickering into one of the largest supply and fortification complexes on the Western River system, a network of earthworks, powder magazines, and covered passages cut directly into the Loess itself, because Loess holds a dug chamber the way almost no other soil can, without shoring, without masonry, sometimes for years. By 1863, Fort Pickering is also a mustering ground for United States colored troops, thousands of formerly enslaved men, enlisting on the same bluff their ancestors' captors had bought from the Chickasaw 45 years before. The record of exactly how many underground chambers the engineers cut into that bluff, and exactly where, does not survive intact. Army engineering logs from minor and mid-sized posts were routinely incomplete even during the war, and what Fort Pickering did keep was scattered across at least 3 different quartermaster departments, whose post-war records were never fully reunited. What is certain, because the terrain itself confirms it, is that the bluff underneath Memphis was excavated, tunneled, and hollowed on a scale the surviving paperwork cannot fully account for. 240 miles south, the same soil produces the most thoroughly documented version of what a Loess bluff can become when people move into it deliberately. During the siege of Vicksburg, from May 18th to July 4th, 1863, Union artillery fires an estimated 22,000 shells a day into a city built on the same wind-blown silt as the Chickasaw Bluffs, and the residents respond by doing exactly what the ground allows them to do. They dig in. Contemporary accounts describe more than 500 cave dwellings carved into the Vicksburg Bluffs by the end of the siege, some no larger than a closet, others multi-room shelters with packed dirt floors, carpeted walls, and furniture carried down from houses above. Mary Ann Loughborough, the wife of a Confederate officer, lived in one of these caves with her young daughter for the length of the siege, and published a memoir of it the following year, titled My Cave Life in Vicksburg, a first-hand account of exactly the kind of chamber the Loess Bluffs make possible under enough pressure. The book survives. Copies sit in university archive collections today, the object that stayed when almost everything else about that year in Vicksburg has faded into summary. What Loughborough describes, room by room, is not folklore. It is an engineering fact about a specific kind of dirt, recorded by a woman who lived inside it for 47 days and had no reason to exaggerate what the ground could do. Loughborough describes neighbors who dug 2- and 3-room caves connected by short passages, families who papered the dirt walls with wallpaper salvaged from their houses before the shelling made those houses unlivable, and a market economy that briefly formed around cave excavation itself, with enslaved and free laborers hired to dig for residents who could pay for a larger or better braced shelter than they could manage alone. Union soldiers who later occupied the city referred to the hillside as Prairie Dog Village, a phrase meant to mock, but one that also, unintentionally, describes with some accuracy just how thoroughly the bluff had been turned into a functioning underground settlement in under 2 months. Natchez, further south still on the same river, on the same Loess formation, tells a version of the story with the outcome reversed. Instead of shelter, the bluff there has produced more than a century of documented collapse. Landslips along the Natchez Bluff destroyed sections of the town's riverfront district repeatedly through the 1800s, most severely in a series of slides recorded through the 1830s and again later in the century, undermining buildings that stood too close to the edge of ground that looked solid until the moment it wasn't. Geological surveys conducted on the Natchez Bluffs in the 20th century confirmed what residents had already learned through repeated loss. The same internal piping that hollows a Loess bluff into rooms and passages can just as easily hollow it into a void with no ceiling left to hold, and the two outcomes, shelter and collapse, come from the identical geological process running slightly differently underground, invisible until the surface gives way. The under-the-hill district at the base of the Natchez Bluff, once a busy river landing lined with warehouses and taverns, has been rebuilt and abandoned in sections more than once over 2 centuries, precisely because the bluff above it periodically decides, on its own schedule, that it no longer intends to hold the shape people built against. 2 cities, 1 geology, 2 entirely different records of what the ground beneath the Chickasaw Bluffs is capable of doing without anyone directing it. In neither city does the geology care what nation's name has been attached to the bluff that year. The Loess responds to water, gravity, and time, the same 3 forces it answered to for thousands of years before Jackson and Shelby sat down at Old Town, and the same 3 forces it will keep answering to long after every treaty signed on its account has been filed away and forgotten by everyone except historians and title lawyers. South of Memphis, on a low rise above the same river system, sits a Mississippian period village site that predates all of this by 500 years. 2 boys exploring the bluff in 1940 found broken pottery eroding out of the ground, and the excavation that followed carried out under a Depression-era public works archaeology program, uncovered a planned village of houses arranged around a central plaza, with a temple mound at one end, built and occupied roughly between the years 1000 and 1500 by ancestors of the Muskogean-speaking peoples who would later be known, among other names, as Chickasaw and Choctaw. The site is called Chucalissa, a word borrowed from Choctaw meaning abandoned house, a name chosen by later archaeologists rather than a name the original builders used for themselves. It has operated as a museum since 1956, staffed for decades in cooperation with descendant Choctaw and Chickasaw community members who consult on how the site's story is told. The excavation reconstructed several house foundations at full scale and left the temple mound itself largely intact rather than fully excavated, a choice that preserves what remains inside it for a future generation of archaeologists working with methods the 1940s dig crew did not have access to, and that choice, more than any sealed door in a fabricated cave, is the closest thing this stretch of river actually offers to a chamber deliberately left for later. Chucalissa is not a chamber beneath the bluffs. It is something more useful than that. It is proof. Sitting in the open air a few miles from Fort Pickering's dismantled earthworks, that the bluffs were inhabited, built upon, and organized by indigenous communities for centuries before any American surveyor arrived to rename the ridge after the nation he was about to displace from it. The temple mound at the site's center, built up in layers over generations, sits roughly a mile and a half from the nearest surviving trace of Fort Pickering's earthworks, close enough that a person standing on one can see the tree line marking the other, two structures separated by 5 centuries and one river Cession, both built by people who dug into the same bluff for reasons the Loess itself never distinguished between. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. Fort Pickering does not survive the peace the way it survived the war. Beginning in 1865 and continuing through 1866, the War Department orders the post drawn down, its garrison reduced, its structures stripped for salvageable material, its earthworks left to erode back into the bluff that produced them. Within a decade, the fortification that once held one of the largest concentrations of underground military construction on the Mississippi River has been absorbed back into the growing city of Memphis, its magazines filled in, its covered ways collapsed or built over, its precise engineering plan never fully reconstructed because no single surviving document maps the whole complex at once. This is not suppression in the sense of a deliberate order to erase a record. It is the far more common and far less dramatic pattern that swallows most wartime infrastructure once its usefulness ends. Nobody assigned to preserve it, no institution whose job it was to keep the whole picture together, and a landscape more than willing to reclaim what people stop maintaining. The quartermaster records that do survive are split today between at least 3 separate federal record groups, filed by department rather than by post, so that reconstructing a single complete map of what Fort Pickering's engineers actually dug into the bluff requires cross-referencing paperwork that was never meant to be read side by side. Researchers who have attempted it describe the surviving record as a set of fragments that agree on the fort's outline and disagree, sometimes sharply, on what lay beneath it. The document that actually carries a Chickasaw record, dated 1866, exists, and it has nothing to do with a hidden chamber. On April 28th of that year, in Washington, delegates of the Chickasaw Nation and the Choctaw Nation sign a treaty with the United States, one of several so-called Reconstruction treaties forced on the nations that had been removed to Indian Territory a generation earlier and that had, under significant pressure and internal division, entered into agreements with the Confederacy during the war just ended. The 1866 treaty requires the Chickasaw Nation to formally abolish slavery within its own borders, to extend rights of citizenship and land to formerly enslaved Chickasaw freedmen, and to cede the so-called leased district, a large tract of land in the western part of the nation's Indian Territory holdings, back to the United States for eventual settlement by other tribes. The question of Chickasaw freedmen citizenship raised in that treaty is not a closed one even now. It resurfaces in tribal and federal courts across the following century and a half, a live legal question rather than a settled footnote, which makes the 1866 treaty one of the rare documents in this story whose consequences are still being argued rather than merely archived. It is a document about coerced land loss and about the aftermath of slavery inside a nation that had itself been forcibly displaced less than 3 decades earlier. It says nothing about caves, chambers, or warnings passed down about ground back east that the Chickasaw people had already been forced to leave in the 1830s, under treaties that predate even the 1866 document by decades. That is the actual shape of the record, and it is worth sitting with plainly. The Chickasaw Nation did not leave behind, in 1866 or any other year, a documented account of a secret room beneath the bluffs that bear their name. What the Chickasaw Nation left behind is a treaty concerning citizenship, slavery, and land, signed by a government they had been repeatedly forced to negotiate with at gunpoint and at the negotiating table both, 38 years after the first commissioners took their homeland on the Mississippi and called the resulting cliffs by their name, as if the naming were compensation enough. The chamber, if there is one worth talking about, was never underground. It was the gap between what the United States took from the Chickasaw Nation in 1818 and what it required of the Chickasaw Nation in 1866, a gap the historical record documents with treaty language, congressional ratification dates, and land cession maps, rather than with rumor. None of this makes the physical bluffs themselves any less real or any less strange. The Loess formation that carries the Chickasaw name from Fulton down through Fort Pillow's Bluff, through Memphis's Fourth Bluff, and on south past Vicksburg and Natchez, is still there, still capable of holding a room without a single brace, still occasionally opening a new void where a road or a foundation used to stand. Engineers who work on riverfront construction along this stretch of the Mississippi still treat Loess as a soil that requires its own specialized handling, distinct from anything else in ordinary civil engineering practice, precisely because it behaves like something built rather than something merely deposited. Mary Ann Loughborough's cave in Vicksburg, Fort Pickering's vanished magazines in Memphis, the collapsing storefronts of old Natchez, and the plaza and temple mound at Chucalissa are 4 different expressions of the same ground, doing 4 different things to 4 different groups of people who lived on it, fought over it, or were forced off of it. Stand today on the bluff in downtown Memphis, on ground that was Chickasaw land until the autumn of 1818, fortified military ground through the 1860s, and quietly reabsorbed into an ordinary American city in the decades after, and there is nothing to see. No plaque marks where Fort Pickering's magazines once sat below the surface. No marker distinguishes the Loess under the pavement from any other soil a pedestrian might walk across without a second thought. What the record actually holds, once you set aside the version built for a thumbnail and a runtime, is a name taken from a nation that was removed from the land it described, a war fortification hollowed into ground that made hollowing easy, and a treaty signed 48 years after the first one, in a different territory 1,000 miles away, that had nothing to do with caves and everything to do with what the United States still required of the Chickasaw Nation, even after there was nothing left on the Mississippi to take. The bluffs kept the name. The nation kept walking, further west, further from the river, carrying a different kind of record than the one this story went looking for, and a more honest one. That record does not require a sealed door, a missing witness, or a single invented sentence attributed to a people who never needed this channel's version of drama to make their history worth telling. It requires only the treaties themselves, still readable in full in the National Archives, still cited by name in tribal and federal court filings today, still describing exactly what was taken, in what year, and under what pressure, without a single gap that anyone has ever needed to fill in with a rumor about caves. What the Chickasaw Nation recorded, it recorded in its own name, in its own delegation signatures, on paper that has survived intact for a century and a half. That is not a smaller story than the one this video's title promised. It is simply the one that actually happened. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, The other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.